Ready? Okay. Okay. So putting together this year was very interesting for me because when we were picking dates, I noticed that this Parsha had a lot to do with Melacha and Shabbos, which, to be very honest, is not my absolute favorite area of halacha. And so instead of shying away from it, I decided to take it on as a challenge and make this meaningful for me. So thank you for giving me this opportunity to face something I didn't want to do and actually find quite a bit of meaning in it. I sent out the source sheet earlier, so if you can open it up in front of you, we are going to start with a Gemara in Masachet Shabbos. And I'll just fill everyone in while they're opening it up and while they're looking at it. So the word shogeg means by accident. You do something accidentally. And there are two kinds of shogeg, two kinds of accidents when we're talking about Shabbos. The first kind is where you don't know it's Shabbos, and so you do something that's against Shabbos. So I wake up and I think that it's Friday, and so I turn on my stove. That's the most straightforward kind of shogeg. The other kind is that you do know that it's Shabbos, but you don't know that what you're doing is Melacha. It's one of the prohibited actions, which is in practice, obviously, much more common that we know it's Shabbos and we might violate something. And when I was learning Hilchot Shabbos, my rabbi told me when you learn Hilchot Kashrut, you learn that everything you do is fine and that you can relax. That everything you do is fine. It's very hard to screw up Kashrut. When you learn Hilchot Shabbos, you learn that everything you do is not fine. And Shabbos is much harder. So this is one of those areas where even though you do actually know it's Shabbos and know what Melacha is, it's much easier to kind of make a mistake than it would be in an area, for example, like Kashrut. So we're going to read the Gemara. It would be really nice if we can do still people reading, even though we're not in person. Does anyone want to read or should I read? If you'd like to read, feel free to unmute yourself. Otherwise, I'm happy to read.
I think it's set that you can unmute yourselves. So if you do want to speak, then please just press the unmute button.
Okay. No one wants to read. That's fine. It's Wednesday. We're all there. Okay. Tanan, we learn in a Mishnah. Avot Melachot Arba'im Chaser Echad. The Gemara is taking us back to the previous Mishnah and saying that the number of kind of primary categories of things that are prohibited on Shabbat is 40 minus 1. And the Mishnah then goes on to list it, but that's not what happens in our Gemara. The Havinan Bey, sorry, hold on one minute. Minyane Lamali. So the Gemara then asks, why do I need them to tell me how many malachot are there? Why not just tell us the list? These are the malachot, and then list 39 malachot. Why does it have to tell me that there are 39 malachot and then go on to list it? The Gemara continues, V'amar Rabbi Yochanan, She'im asa'an kulam behelam echad, chayav al kol achad achad. That if someone was to violate all of them in one kind of occurrence, that they would be chayav, they would be obligated or liable for each and every one of these malachot. How someone could violate all 39 in kind of one incident is, I don't know. I don't know how someone could violate all of them, but that is what the Gemara is asking. So the Mishnah is going on to list them, and the Gemara says, under what circumstances can you find a case that someone would actually do all of these? It must be in a case where the actions were intentional, that they are aware that it's Shabbos, and it's regard to these malachot that they don't know what they are. So it's eliminating that first category that we talked about where they don't know it's Shabbos. And it must be a case where they don't know what the malachot are. So this kind of sets us in that frame. We had two possibilities of what shgaga is, what this mistake is. Is this a case where someone doesn't know it's Shabbos and violates all 39? It is not, according to Rabbi Yochanan. This is a case where someone does know it's Shabbos, but they don't know what the Melacha are. So the question of the Gemara is, why does it have to say 39? Why not just list them? Rabbi Yochanan, he explains that it specifically says that because if in one episode you violate all 39, you have to bring 39 individual korbanot for the sin of shkaga. So it would be an individual korban for each melacha violated. So I put a ... in ellipses at the top because we're going to skip a little bit of the Gemara. But the Gemara goes on to ask, how is it possible? Like, how can you possibly have a situation where someone knows that it's Shabbos, but doesn't know any of the rules of Shabbos? Isn't that a contradiction in terms? Most people who know what Shabbos is can give you a general idea of what Shabbos is. So how can you not possibly know what Melacha is? Like the bigger question here is, isn't Shabbos defined by the Melacha, by the actions that we are not allowed to perform on it? According to the Gemara, those are the things that define Shabbos for us. So the Gemara gives a fairly technical answer to this question. How is it possible that someone doesn't know what these melachot are? Surely if you know about Shabbos, you know what melacha is, you know what these forbidden actions are, these forbidden kinds of work. And the Gemara answers, Diyadale Shabbat Lamai, with regard to what aspect of Shabbos was he aware then? If he didn't know that there was melacha, what did he know? And the Gemara answers, Diyare B'tchumen, the Aliba de Rabbi Akiva. The Gemara answers by saying that this person he doesn't know what melachot are. He doesn't know the 39 prohibited acts, but this person does know the laws of tchumen, which are the prohibited boundaries that one is not allowed to go beyond a city on Shabbat. And this is the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. So although this person doesn't actually know what you can't do in terms of what we might think of as like the normal things that you can't do on Shabbos, they do know about this one prohibition, and therefore they would still fall into that category of knowing it's Shabbos, but not knowing melachot. Gideon and I were discussing yesterday how this is like one of Gideon's favorite pieces of Gemara. So we were discussing yesterday how it could be possible for someone to like know what melacha is, but not know that it's prohibited. Surely someone who has any sort of understanding of Shabbos understands kind of the basics. Like you can't, you can't tear, you can't use electricity, you can't build, you can't, whatever, the basics. So we were trying to think of an example of someone who doesn't know what melacha is, or someone who does know what melacha is, but doesn't know what the melachot are. So my kind of thought on this of someone who knows it's Shabbat, but doesn't really know what melacha is someone who knows in theory that there is an isur, that there is an isur of a melacha. So for example, let's say bona or building. Someone knows that there is an isur of bona. Someone knows that you're not allowed to build on Shabbos. What it means to build could be any number of things. So someone might know in theory, I'm prohibited from building things on Shabbos. They might not know that bona, building, includes something like braiding hair, for example. Braiding hair is bona. So I think it actually is kind of possible that someone might know what melacha is, but not actually know what falls under it. For example, schita or squeezing, someone very well might know that you're not allowed to wring out a sponge on Shabbos, but they might not know that you can't wring out your hair on Shabbos. So the idea that someone doesn't know melacha just because they don't, that you might not know specifics of melacha, even though you know what the melacha is in a broader sense. So while the Gemara asks that question, I do actually think it's quite possible for someone to not know that. There's an amazing Tosfot on this. It's super short. The best Tosfots are. It's very, very short. And it's on the words Diyada le betchumen. It's talking about the person who knows the boundaries that you can't leave outside the city. This is, I feel like most people don't know that much about tchumen, though I know my mother-in-law's father was very into tchumen. But I think in general, people probably know more about Melacha than they do about tchumen. So this is the rare example of someone who is the opposite and only knows about tchumen and doesn't know about Melacha. Okay, so the Tosfot says, Tema lari, Da'amai lo ka'amar diyada le l'shabat pe'ase. The Rees has a question on this, and he says, why did the Gemara not say that this is a person who knows the positive commandments of Shabbat, not the negative commandments? And then the Tosfot goes on to give two examples of positive commandments. Uvayom hashvi'i Toshvot, sorry. And the other one is Uchtiv Nami, another pasuk, V'shamartem et HaShabbat, and you should keep Shabbat. These are positive commandments, not negative ones. Not don't do this malacha, don't tear, don't build, don't squeeze, but the positive ones of resting and of keeping the Shabbat. So instead of it being a person who knows tchumen, who like you wouldn't actually expect someone to know tchumen if they don't know that the idea of Melacha. That would be a very kind of odd and rare person. But it is conceivable that someone might say, oh, I know what Sabbath is. I know there's this idea that you are commanded to rest on that day. It is a positive commandment. And the Re is telling us that that is the person that we are talking about here. This brings up kind of a very fundamental question about the nature of Shabbos. The Gemara assumes that the 39 Melachot, the 39 prohibitions, are at the core of Shabbos. So Shabbos is kind of defined based on what we're not allowed to do. And if you don't know about these prohibitions, then you don't really know what Shabbos is. The Gemara can't conceive of someone who understands Shabbos but doesn't understand what you're not allowed to do on it. But according to the Tosfot, Shabbos is actually about a lot more than the things we can't do. It's also about the things that we have to do. This person might know you're supposed to make kiddush and that you're supposed to rest. They just might not know that you can't rip or do any of the other things, wash things, whiten things. So this makes Shabbos into something much bigger than the rules which the Gemara defines it by. It's about the separation and the distinction from the rest of the week and about the rest, which is a really kind of powerful interjection into this argument that's very technical about Melachot and all these rules about things we can't do on Shabbos. The Ria is reminding us that Shabbos is much bigger in a spiritual way. It's much bigger than just the things that we cannot do. Before we go into the psukim that the Tosfot lists, and we're going to explore those too, does anyone have any? I want to pause here for any thoughts or questions or comments.
So what's you say that the Tosfot is asking a question?
Yes, the question is, why didn't the Gemara just say that it's someone who knows the Aseh, that's someone who knows the positive commandment?
And what's the answer to that?
It's a rhetorical question. It's saying the question is like, who, hold on, let me just go back so I could read it out. So the question is, Diyada le l'Shabbat b'mai, which element of Shabbos was he aware of?
Yeah.
So the Gemara answers, he must have been aware of tchumen, of this kind of other thing. And so the Re is saying, no, why didn't the Gemara just say he was aware of the positive things? This doesn't have to be someone who, and maybe it's less, the Ri is saying it's less probable that someone would know Tchumen and not Melacha, but it's much more probable that someone would know you're commanded to rest and not know what the Melachot are than know Tchumen and not know what the Melachot are.
So he's giving an alternative answer to the question.
Yeah, I think he's saying this should have been the answer.
Right.
Any other thoughts, questions, comments? Nope. Okay, I will move forward. Okay, we are going to read a pasuk from Shemot. This is the first pasuk that's quoted in the Tosfot. Sheshet yamim ta'aseh ma'asecha v'yom hashvi'i tishbot leman yanuach shorcha v'chamorecha v'yinafash bein amatcha ve'ager. 6 days you should do your work, but on the 7th day you should stop doing work in order that your ox and your donkey may rest, and that your slave and the stranger may be refreshed. So this pasuk is much more universal. This pasuk doesn't really seem to be targeting Jews or specifying Jews. It actually Davka doesn't, because it includes animals and it includes slaves, which may have been Jewish, but may have not been Jewish. So this first pasuk where we're commanded to keep Shabbat is a kind of universal view of Shabbat. It's a day of rest. And we know that we are not the only people, Jews are not the only people who have kind of a Sabbath day, a day of rest that is just kind of generally a day where we step back and kind of relate to God in a different way. This is not our commandment to do specific things. This is not our commandment to not do specific things. This is a general commandment in the positive to rest. Sforno has also a really, I put in the English here. He has, I think, what I think is a great kind of addition to this, which he says on the word tishbot. He says, you must refrain from doing things which are not prohibited under the heading of Melacha. So it's not just, it's like a bit of a reframing or like a pulling us back down to earth. We might be so focused on only not doing Melachot, but this Sforno is saying, and I think this is what the Ri was also trying to get us to remember, is that there are certain things we have to do on Shabbos or not do on Shabbos that are also about the spirit of the law, the spirit of the day, and not just the letter of the day. So it's possible that one might check all the boxes of not doing a Melacha, or I guess not check those boxes of not doing Melacha, but they're not fulfilling the spirit of the day, which is a day of rest and relaxation and kind of rejuvenation and connecting to God. We have another pasuk from Shemot that tells us a positive commandment about Shabbos. It says, "Ushmartem et Shabbat ki kadosh hilachem michal alea mot yamut ki kol haoseh ba melacha v'nichreta nefesh hahi mikerev amea." So you have to keep the Shabbos because it is holy or separate or distinct for you. Anyone who profanes it shall be put to death. Whoever does work on it, that person has to be cut off from amongst our people. So this is much more of a technical definition of Shabbos. It's not just kind of a nice spiritual relaxing day off. It's something that we have to be very, very meticulous in keeping. Anyone who profanes it should be put to death. The death penalty is not something that gets thrown out lightly in the Torah, as I'm sure you all know. And whoever does work on it should be cut off. They are not in the spirit of what the day is, and they are kind of kicked out from amongst us because we don't tolerate that within our group. So this is a much more specific kind of directive for Shabbos, but also even though it's in the positive, like when you think of a positive commandment, you might think of something a little nicer. Even though this is in the positive that you should keep Shabbat, there is definitely a heaviness to this pasuk that you might not expect with kind of a mitzvah aseh. Any thoughts? Do one of these two psukim resonate more for anyone? The first one or the second? The more kind of universal idea of Shabbat, like a day of rest versus a day where we're very, very careful and have to be very meticulous in making sure we don't violate anything. Or do people find that it's somewhere in the middle? Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
I guess the first one is more positive in that makes you more, you want to keep Shabbat because it's positive. It makes you feel that you want to engage in it, whereas the other one is slightly more punishing. So maybe it focuses on the negative and less enticing, I suppose.
Do you feel like the way that we keep Shabbat is more like one or the other?
I think I don't know. My experience is that perhaps it's more on the positive than on the negative. That we don't see punishments as we go through Shabbat as such on a weekly basis.
Yeah, I think also because we don't do punishments, whatever was meant to be kind of highlighted in this pasuk is not really. It doesn't carry the same weight in the world we live in now. We don't have a Beit Din that executes the death sentence. And even if someone violates Shabbos, we know that we don't treat people that way. We would never say, you don't keep Shabbos, you can't be part of our community, you can't, like, that's not how we act. If anything, sometimes we're kind of the opposite of that. You don't keep Shabbos, come join our community, come spend time with us, come experience that rest that Shabbos can offer when it's not something that you typically do. So I think I agree, like while it's set out in this really harsh way, even though we are careful and meticulous in the instruction of keeping Shabbat and what it means, we don't actually have the negative or the punishment element because it's just not the world we live in.
And it's also from an educational point of view. When you've got small kids, it's very hard to do the whole don't do this, don't do this. If like Rabbi Sack said, if you want your children to love Judaism and love religious life, you've got to love it. You've got to show them that you love it. So you have to emphasize the positive at different stages of life, I would suggest.
Yeah, for sure. Saying don't do something does not work for everyone. For sure, for kids, it doesn't work. And framing it in a more positive, let's not focus on what this day isn't or what this day can't be, but what this day is and what this day should be or could be, is definitely a more positive way to frame this. Okay, so the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, he kind of brings it together. He says, "Ushmartam et Shabbat ki kadosh ki lachem." He's quoting the pasuk, and he says, "Mahi shimur shel Shabbat." What does it mean to keep Shabbat? Milavir ba'esh. Don't do any work. Don't transfer a fire. Umilasot bo melacha. Don't do melacha. Umilatzeit umilavo chutz letchum. And it means don't go inside and outside of the tchum, this boundary. Not even with 1 foot. Afilu ragel achat. You can't even take 1 foot out of that boundary. Umilavi davar biyado. You can't carry anything in their hands. Arba amot b'reshut harabim. 4 amot in the public property. Ulehotzim yershut lereshut. And you can't go from one property to another property. You can't carry something from one property to another property. V'zo hi shmira ta shel Shabbat. And this is what it means for him to keep Shabbat. And this is a very again, going back to, this is a definition of Shabbat that is very much based on Melacha. It's very much based on the things we are not allowed to do. We are not allowed to be mavir eish. We can't move one flame to somewhere else. We're not allowed to do melacha. We're not allowed to go inside or outside of tchum. It's defining Shabbos by all of the things that we are not allowed to do. So this is very much keeping in line with the way that the Gemara set out the definition of Shabbos. Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch does not take that approach. This is a really lovely quote. I kind of shortened it. But for Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, it is much more of a spiritual experience, and it's not just about these small prohibitions. We aren't defining the day by what we can't do. We are building a day that is something kind of positive with us and God. So he says, for 6 days, the world is yours. For 6 days, you may exercise melacha on all the things that God has created, placing them in your own creative stamp as you transform them into the finished object of your will and purpose. However, on the 7th day, you shall declare that the world is not entirely your domain, that it is not you who is the Lord and Master, but that you are merely God's servant on earth, living and working by his grace. Through Isur Melacha, you place yourself and your world reverently on God's consecrating, I think I spelled that wrong, sorry, God's consecrating altar. Through Isur Melacha, you elevate the 24 hours of the Shabbat into a universal offering to your God and to your own consecration. So there's both elements here. There is the things that we are not allowed to do. There's what we can't do. And then through what we can't do, we create something positive. It is a way for us to kind of relate to God in a bigger sense. This isn't just about us resting and resting because God rested. Part of us resting is not just reflecting God, which is like in the first parak of Bereshit, we are built b'tzelem Elokim, and just like God creates and works through the week and rests on Shabbat, so too we work through the week and rest on Shabbat. But what Rav Hirsch is explaining is that there's something much bigger about the spiritual significance of God, which is not just mirroring what God did, not just acting in the way that God acted by ceasing to work on Shabbos, but it's about reminding us that in many ways during the week, while we might feel we are in complete control, we are actually not in complete control. And Shabbos reminds us that there is something bigger than us. And the Isur Melacha, the prohibition of doing all of these different things, is a way for us to kind of remind ourselves that there is something bigger than us, and we answer to something else. I didn't think of this when I was putting together the class, but I thought of it just now, so I'm going to share it. There is a really, really awesome midrash in Bereshit Rabbah that talks about the things that God planned to create. God created the nefesh of them, but then the actual creation, the actual goof, the body, for all of them but one, doesn't get created. So I'm not going to open it on my computer now. Basically, I'm just going to summarize it. So there's a midrash that says God set out to create the following things and created them in spirit. And then God went to create their bodies, and God almost created all of them, but there was one that was missing that was created in spirit and not body. Different commentaries take this in different ways. But one of my absolute kind of favorite commentaries on this is that we are supposed to learn from Shabbat that even if God sets out to do something during the week and kind of runs out of time, so too we are human. And Shabbat, we have to stop on Shabbos. God stopped on Shabbos, and if God can stop what God is doing, we can certainly stop what we are doing. And if God can make a checklist and just stop one thing short, then we should feel permission and feel okay to kind of stop one thing short during our week. Which obviously God does not forget to do things and does not run out of time. But the Midrash is telling us that the reason God did that was to give us permission to be human. And that one of the kind of consequences to relating to God so closely on Shabbos is to be reminded of our humanity, and to be reminded of our limits, which I find to be a really beautiful idea, that not just connecting to God is enriching for us in an important spiritual connection, but it's also important in the way we view ourselves and in our own kind of humanness. Okay, I want to just end with, well, not end, but start to wrap things up with a pasuk about Kedusha, which is going to be familiar, but I want to kind of tie it back into Hilchot Shabbos. So the pasuk is from Vayikra, and it says, "Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe lemor, daber el kol adat bnei Yisrael ve'amarta alehem kedoshim tiyu ki kadosh ani Hashem Elokechem." God says to Moshe, saying, "Speak to the whole community of Bnei Israel and tell them, you should be holy, you should be separate, you should be designated, however you want to define that. For I, your God, am separate or designated." So I happen to love Kedusha, like not Kedusha as holiness, but Kedusha as separateness. It's an idea that I've spent a really, really long time exploring. It's kind of the lens through which I do a lot of my learning and a lot of my teaching. And so I wanted to just talk about it with you all for a little bit. So there are two elements kind of in relationships, and the way we talk about Kedusha, the way we talk about designation or separateness, or really more broadly, our relationship with God. When we have a relationship, there are things we do for one another or together, and there are things that we don't do. The things that we do in this example would be the positive commandment of Shabbat. That is one thing we do for for our relationship with God. And there is also a part of the commitment and part of the designation that we have with our relationship with God, which are things that we don't do. And that's not just true of Shabbat. It's not just true that we give up things or we live our life in a different way one day a week. We are kadosh, we are differentiators in every moment of our life. We are constantly differentiating things throughout our day. We do that in terms of the way we speak, the words we choose to use. We do it in terms of even something as simple as putting on our shoes in the morning. We have a distinct and different way of doing it than the rest of the world. And part of the reason we do that is because the way in which we differentiate ourselves is what brings us closer to God. And God that's exactly what God is telling us in this pasuk. You will be a differentiator. You will be someone who separates space, separates time, separates language, separates relationships. You will be a separator, just like God is a separator throughout Tanakh, but it's kind of most glaring in Sefer Bereshit and Genesis. God separates the heavens and the earth. God separates the water from the dry land. God is constantly separating. Then God separates Shabbat. And so in order for us to live in God's image, we are asked to constantly separate. That is, and we see again, it's not just God who does it. God separates Abraham for the Jewish people. Abraham separates himself from those around him as a commitment to God. God designates us as a nation for a special relationship with God. This is probably why the more universalist approach to Shabbos, to a day of rest, was accepted by everyone, by many, many nations. It's not just us who have an idea of a day of rest or a day for God, but Shabbat, which is specifically commanded for God to the Jewish people, is a designated time to make our relationship distinct from the relationship that God has with other nations. These are the things we do in our relationship to have a level of intimacy with God. The idea of separating or doing something different, again, it's something we do in every relationship. We define how close we are with God by basically the intimacy we create with God, which is by not only actively and positively choosing to bring God into our lives, which we do through how we eat, how we observe mitzvot in every area, and also by the things we don't do, by the things we don't eat, by the words we don't use, by the relationships we don't have. And so that's just kind of ingrained in who we are. And I was so tempted to make this shiur about muktzah, because muktzah is like the part of Shabbos to me that has always been about kedusha. Muktzah is like, it's an object that doesn't have a use on Shabbos, so we don't touch it. So I'll just give an example. The example in the Gemara is, if someone is a professional chef, their knives are muktzah on Shabbat. It's not Melacha to use those knives, but they're muktzah because they're used for work. And so therefore they have no use on Shabbat. I'll give you another example. This is my favorite example of muktzah. My mom's going to like this because she's on. Okay. My family is very, very serious about Thanksgiving. Very serious about Thanksgiving. We have, not my mom, but my aunt and uncle have a specific set of salt and pepper shakers shaped like turkeys, which we use every single Thanksgiving. They are not used ever on a non-Thanksgiving day. So those turkey shakers would be muktzah. They have no use on Shabbos. We don't use them. You can't touch them. They have no purpose on that day. So even though we normally think about muktzah as like a remote control because it has to do with the TV, and because we don't watch TV, we don't need the remote, there are other kind of more niche things we might have in our home that might fall into that. All of this is to say, the intentional kind of designation of items, of time, of actions, of all of these things, this is kedusha. We talk about kedusha as this idea of holiness, kedoshim tihiyu, be holy, but that's not actually what it is. It's be separate, designate this relationship. And I think when I kind of started and like made the commitment to myself to do this shiur about Melacha, I didn't really know where I was going to take it, but not surprising that it came back to kedusha, because most things that I do come back to kedusha. But it is a good reminder that in relationships, not just our relationship with God, but certainly our relationship with God, in relationships, there are things we do for one another, and there are things we don't do because of the other person, or we don't do to them, or we don't do around them, whatever it is. And there are kind of positives and positive sides, and kind of the negative sides, or things we don't do in any relationship. And so just like kedusha is like the positive act of differentiating or distinguishing a time and a space, Melacha is just the flip side of that relationship. And so it's not just this kind of like technical list of things we can get lost in and things we can be anxious about violating on Shabbat, because there are so many, and they basically are very, very easy to slip up on. Like if you grab a sponge or whatever it is, rip toilet paper, it's much easier to violate Shabbat than it is to violate other areas. But obviously the important thing is keeping them. But the reason we keep them is not just because of the technicalities of them, but because these commitments to the small things that every relationship has, small things, but the commitment to refraining from doing certain things, that is how we distinguish this relationship with God from other relationships that we have. And it's also how God distinguishes our relationship from God with other nations, which I think is, at least to me, like a much more positive way to look at Melacha, which sometimes could feel negative because there are mitzvot lo taseh. There are things that you are not allowed to do. But at the end of the day, I think looking at the things that you aren't allowed to do as a kind of means to an end of a closeness and an intimacy with God, but also a fulfillment of what it means to have a restful day, really that is fulfilling the positive, but a restful day, and also a day in which we are able to live in God's image and successfully rest, successfully designate that day from the rest of the week and separate it from our normal time and space. The only way we can do that is through both. It's through the balance of the positive and the negative commandments. So I hope that's like maybe a helpful reframing of Melacha. I don't know if anyone else needed a reframing of Melacha. But this is, I always say whenever I write a shiur, I write it like where I'm at. And so I'm very happy that I took another look at this, because usually I don't look at Melacha and think, oh, this is like positive about our relationship with God. It's very easy to get caught up in the technicalities of it and kind of see them for just that instead of see them for something bigger. Does anyone have any thoughts, questions?
I've always been a bit puzzled about why Tehum has become, is in the Gemara such a very key part of Shabbat. It's one that nowadays is hardly meaningful to us because most of us don't live anywhere near where there could even be. But I'm wondering, in light of what you said, whether maybe it's because Tehum is by its definition a boundary, and the issa there is to cross the boundary is what's forbidden. And that's sort of quite similar in a way to Kedusha. I mean, you're crossing the boundary into something. And maybe that's why Tehum is such a key element. And why the Gemara says that, you could have somebody who understands the concept of a boundary on Shabbat, but has no idea how to actually execute that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think also the language that's used about the Tehum, not in the Gemara, but the language that is later used in discussing the Tehum, I think it was it Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer? Yep, in Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, where he says you can't even step on it with one foot. That like it's a boundary isn't just about crossing it, but there's like something a little sneaky about sticking your foot on that boundary, and that's also kind of against the spirit of the day as well.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts, questions?
Yep. Can I come back to the issue of the death penalty?
Sure.
Did it ever happen?
I have no idea. Rabbi Belofsky probably. I mean, I do not know.
I
So
only
I get
asked.
drafted in to deal with the unpleasant questions. I see. Ramie, how
I mean,
it works.
it happened once in the desert, right?
I think that it's worth remembering that the Mishnah itself debates this question in the first chapter, at the last Mishnah in the first chapter of Makos, discusses how frequently a court would have to execute the death penalty to be considered to be bloodthirsty. And bearing in mind, this is not just for breaking Shabbos, it's for many other things. And there's a three-way disagreement. One said it once in 7 years, once in 70 years, and the third is they said they would never do it ever. And so clearly this issue about how rigorously one applied these laws, rather than just to understand that they are means the matters of extreme and existential importance, is a debate even in the 2nd century, not one that we can resolve in the few minutes remaining. It would appear that it probably was executed, if that's the right word, carried out, but it would have been extremely rare. Having said that, there is a Gemara in Yevamos which says that the rabbis put to death someone who rode a horse on Shabbos, but in extremis. This was some kind of someone made an example in a period perhaps when society was collapsing. I think all evidence is that while it was discussed in great detail, it was carried out extremely infrequently, if at all. And I'm going to go back to Ramie now.
I was really thinking, Ramie, that, and thank you, Rabbi Belofsky, and I really hear what you're saying. And I wondered, because I did know that expression about being a severe court. I think we really have to look upon Shabbos as something totally beneficial, totally positive, and to have something as harsh as even possibly a death penalty seems to take the edge off it for me. To know that if I do something wrong, somebody can report me and have me put to death is uncomfortable, whereas all the positive things are fantastic. So there's a balance there.
No, I hear that. It is a balance. And I think the same way that we are lucky that we get to live in a world where we don't know who Amalek is, so we can talk about it in theory. We're lucky we don't live in a world where we can be reporting people for violating Shabbos, and therefore we draw from it the kind of the lessons and not the practice. So I don't think that makes anything actually feel better about the fact that it exists, but we live at a point where we can draw meaning from it instead of kind of be hurt by it.
Thank you.
It's quite common in a way in legal agreements that you put in things which are quite punitive, but in a way you don't really expect them to ever happen. They're just a way of reinforcing how important it is that you shouldn't do those things. But it's not so much that, you're very likely to be sued for £1 million or something, but just bear in mind that it is a serious thing. So I think you can look at the death penalty a bit like that.
Yeah, I think also the whole idea that what we're discussing is what does it mean to do something accidentally or by not knowing. It also gives people the benefit of the doubt that someone who violates Shabbos isn't saying, I know exactly what Melacha is, now I'm going to go violate it. It's that people are human. And that's there has to be some leeway. And it's, there are some areas of halacha where, we see the consequence for something, but the way we actually act in practice is not reflective of that. We don't look at people who violate Shabbos as people who deserve the death penalty. If anything, in the I don't know if there's the Shabbos project here, but at least in America, there's a big movement to invite people who don't typically keep Shabbos into our communities every now and then to be able to experience the positive. And we don't look down on them in those spaces of people who are bad Shabbos violators who are deserving of punishment. We look at it as an opportunity to be able to share some of those positives with them. So again, I think we're just lucky to live in a time where we don't have to.
I agree.
Okay, that's it. I'll see you in 2 weeks for a discussion about Purim.
Thank you very much, Ramie, and thank you everyone for coming. And I hope, assuming it's recorded, this Shiur will be on the Shul YouTube channel very shortly. Good evening, and again, thank you to Ramie.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ramie. Thanks. Great.
Thank you, Ramie.